Hi, I'm Phil Craig.
And I'm Andrew Loney.
And together we aim to bring you the most scandalous stories and some of the most scandalous people in history. So thanks for joining us here on the Scandal Mongers podcast. Andrew, I understand you might be wearing shorts.
I am indeed. We've reached that stage of the year.
How many donations will we need for you to stand up at the next episode and show your legs?
Well, we should ask the listeners. I may be disappearing for a long time.
Yes, actually, we should say we have some news. We're going to have a fairly quiet summer. I mean, we're so grateful to everybody who's found us in recent weeks with loads of new subscribers. But we're going to have a fairly quiet summer because Andrew has an exciting but rather secret new project, which is going to keep him quite busy till September.
I'm afraid. So you're going to hold the fort, and I hope even if we're not producing as much material, people will go back and look at some of our previous episodes. I mean, there's a lot of material there, so hopefully you can be kept happy for the few weeks that we're not in tandem.
That's right. I'm going to try doing a couple of shows by myself through August and July, which will be quite interesting and quite fun. I'm sure Andrew will be sending me notes, and then we'll return in full force as the full double act in September. But
So
today, sorry,
we got a bumper issue, end of term. Very important subject for me, and I think for the podcast, freedom of information. We've got David Hooper talking about SLAPPS, which are basically the way the courts are being used by rich people to suppress information being released. But I think we thought it might be quite good just to recap on some of the issues about freedom of information, particularly since we have an election and not one party is addressing this issue, which is about the accountability of government.
that's right. This episode is really about power and truth, which I think has been a theme of many of our shows and is very relevant because we are about to experience a change of government. And you might expect that the Labour Party, perhaps for historical reasons, would be more open to freedom of information. But Andrew, you're not convinced, are you?
Nope, none of them are. I mean, none of them are prepared to. No one wants to have any sort of scrutiny of what they do. I mean, even though there are laws for this. I mean, you would think perhaps the Liberals or others would be keen, or indeed the Conservatives, that they've been very Machiavellian, would have really pushed FOI as a way of being able to hold the Labour government to account should they win. So I think it's very disturbing. We're going backwards in terms of freedom of information. I went to a talk actually on Monday about press regulation, and we're seeing big problems there. There's just fortunately been a defeat of a bill they were trying to bring in, which would have made newspapers responsible for the legal costs in libel cases, even if they'd won, and which is an extraordinary thing. Our civil liberties are constantly being eroded, and I think it's shameful that there's so little interest in FOI, and which
Yes.
I've found, historically over the years with the books I've researched. I mean, I knew
Well, I wanted
nothing
to
about.
ask you about Mountbatten because I think a lot of people won't have watched our first program, and even if they have, it's such an interesting story, and I know you're learning new things all the time. For people who don't know, just could you explain to us what it was about Mountbatten that first drew you to digging into the sort of secrets of his private life, and then what happened?
Yes, I mean, my biography of Mountbatten came out in 2019. There'd been an official book in 1980. And Mountbatten is one of those extraordinary, gigantic figures who bestrides the 20th century. Born in 1900, is assassinated by the IRA in 1979, but had been the last Viceroy of India, had been Chief of the Defence Staff, First Sea Lord during Suez, Supreme Allied Commander during the Second World War. But he had a very interesting private life as well, and of course, a great mentor to several generations of the royal family, right through from George VI and Edward VIII, for whom he would have acted as best man. His best man was, in fact, Edward VIII, through to the Queen and Prince Charles. So an important figure. But what I found was that though there was lots of material around, Southampton University have literally tens of thousands of documents. Much of the stuff was closed, and there were certainly big question marks about whether his private life had been covered up. Until the beginning of the century, you couldn't serve in the armed forces if you were gay. Until the 1960s, it was a criminal offense to be homosexual. And Mountbatten was quite openly bisexual. He actually had affairs with junior members of staff, so there were questions there um, of trust in his relationships. And all this was being covered up. And one of my experiences, for example, was finding in the FBI files an interview with people talking about his perversion for young boys. And when I asked for subsequent
And just take you back,
documents,
that must, because I know this is a story you've told before, but that must have been one of those moments that you don't get very often in a career as a journalist or a researching writer. I mean, what a staggering thing to see.
yes, it was fantastic. And I mean, no one had thought of asking for FBI files on Mountbatten. It made a front page story in the Sunday Times. The book was then serialized by the Times. So yes, it was. It was the sort of evidence we were looking for. Now, of course, FBI files are not always accurate. They just reflect what people told them. But what was interesting is there were a lot of files on him. And you can tell that because of the file numbers on the documents, and they say refer to this one. So you can cross-reference. And I asked for those cross-referenced files to be told that those files, which went back to the 1940s, this was a request, in 2018, they'd been destroyed. And when I asked when they'd been destroyed, I was told after I'd asked for them. So that was a very honest response from the Americans, who clearly
Uh,
been told by the British, once this was highlighted, that this stuff should not just be not released, it should be destroyed. And I think what we forget is something like 80% of records are destroyed with no public record kept of them. And we just have no scrutiny over what is kept and goes. Clearly the administrative files, but there must also be, sorry about this. I'm not here at the moment, but if you'd like to, I'll have to ring you back. Okay, bye.
oh, I'm going to miss our technological breakdowns.
Yeah. So, what I think is so extraordinary is that 80% of files are destroyed. We don't know what has been destroyed. Some of these are administrative files and duplicates, but it's a very easy way, get out of jail free card for anything that might prove embarrassing. And I found this, again, researching my book on the Duke of Windsor. I found there were mirror copies of the Colonial Office files in the archives in the Bahamas, where he was governor during the war, which were pretty complete. And yet they'd been completely weeded in London. And those revealed, for example, that he had sent the Commissioner of Police to another island to save him investigating a case in which a murder case in which the Duke of Windsor was involved. So this is happening the whole time.
Well,
And
I do want to ask you more about the Duke of Windsor. Just finally on Mountbatten, though, because we're talking about power and truth. As you said, there was very few people more powerful than Mountbatten and more famous and more loved, especially after he was assassinated. And yet here we are. And it wasn't just your research. Actually, there had been rumors, mostly unpublished, circulating in our industry amongst journalists for years that he was involved in rings, involving the abuse of children. When I worked on an investigation into the famous Kincora boys' home scandal in Northern Ireland, his name came up. You were the first person to really put hard evidence and hard testimony out there, which is incredible. But it didn't really get you maybe the praise or the acclaim that you perhaps expected. In fact, it got you into a lot of trouble financially and maybe even personally, didn't it?
yes, it did. I mean, I interviewed two boys who had been abused by him in 1977 when they were 16-year-old. In fact, a third boy has now come forward and is mounting a case in Belfast who was abused as a 12-year-old. But yeah, I clearly got on the wrong side of the establishment because of this. And as a result, I found myself under surveillance by the government. I discovered this through putting in basically something called a subject access request, which is a sort of under data protection laws allows you to see what people have on you in public authorities. And though they weren't totally forthcoming, didn't provide the information totally they should have done. They said they had, first of all, they said they had so much material on me, it would be impossible to produce it. It would, the cost compliance level would be broken. But eventually, by narrowing my request to 6-month intervals, I got some material. And this showed that they'd been monitoring my social media, the talks I gave at even pretty obscure bookshops, that they had been briefing the press, members of parliament, the cabinet secretary, inaccurately about me in an attempt to discredit me. They'd even been trying to find information on legal cases in which they could use, I think, as evidence against me. I, at that point, had an employment tribunal and a defamation case from a disgruntled former employee, both of which I won, but which they were monitoring. And
Oh,
this is a very sinister part of we don't expect in this sort of country.
You don't, and going back to the election, you really would think for the Labour Party. I mean, they're probably going to win anyway, but it is very much in their tradition. It should be. I mean, they're built on free speech, um, expanding people's rights. I mean, that goes back to the very core of what Labour used to be. And yet you say
Well,
that they're not really very interested. Maybe they have other priorities, but this is important.
yeah, well, I think they don't want scrutiny. I think that's the point. Anyone who, as soon as they have power, don't want to have to answer questions about it. I mean, my interests are historical. I mean, these stories are often 100 years old, and they're still closed. I mean, we have archives going back to the Victorian period, which are still closed, particularly on the royal family. But I think it should be an issue for all political parties. We're all interested in accountability and transparency, whatever your political hue. And I think it's as vote winner. How can you trust institutions if they're not prepared to be open with you?
I quite agree.
We have a press which we see, so we've talked about so many investigative programs and newspapers have been forced to shut down their units because they can't afford to run them. People want clickbait rather than real news. And there's very little opportunity to hold power to account now, unfortunately. And people are getting away with murder.
Well, I want to talk a bit about the Duke of Windsor because people know a lot about his obviously his love life and his abdication. A certain number of people know also about his connection to the Nazis, partly through your own book. But you found so many interesting things out about him and money, which I don't think anybody really knew about before. And actually, I think this is the theme about the way the royals, in particular, do protect any scrutiny of their private finances and their wealth.
You're absolutely right. I mean, though there are royal accounts every summer, they're very, very difficult to read. They don't always give you all the information you want. A lot of the money the royals have is passed down through trusts, which are closed. Their wills are closed, even pretty minor members of the royal family. It's also very difficult to see where the division between their private wealth and the wealth that comes to them as public figures. For example, uh, if people are given gifts when they're off on trips, watches, etc., are those declared? There was at one point an attempt to have a register of royal gifts and income. To avoid any scandals. It's one of the themes of my book on Prince Andrew. Did he abuse his position as a trade envoy to make money himself when he was meant to be promoting British trade? So there needs to be more openness there, and I'm afraid it's not happening. I mean, it goes right up to the king. There are stories which have still, for various reasons, mainly legal and mainly because one of them is a court action at the moment, where he's been caught basically taking money in plastic bags from rather dodgy people. Now, not for him necessarily personally, but for some of his charities like Dumfries House. But,
That story was quite prominent maybe 2 years ago, and it just disappeared.
it's been killed, but I mean it will come back because one of the people involved, I think, is in court facing charges. So, but of all these subjects are shut down, people do not want to go there. The police do not want to go there. They never investigate the royals. I mean, we've got this with Prince Andrew. There were various people who came forward with accusations about the sex trafficking, and the Met say we've looked at this and there's no case to answer for. But we don't even know the reasons. I mean, they just shut these things down. And I think if you're to have respect and trust these institutions, whether it's the monarchy or governments, you have to have a little bit of light shone onto them. Otherwise, why should we trust anything we're told?
Well, I know you
So
can't talk about certain things about Andrew because of your current book, and hopefully we'll get to hear lots and lots about that when the book's finished. But he was in the news this week again, and again, it's about money and property. Apparently, he's fighting tooth and nail to stay in Royal Lodge and also to be allowed to hand it over to his daughters. Now, I don't know whether he'll win that fight, but clearly this is something that should be, this is public money that's got into these places. We should know more about what's going on.
Well, to be fair, it's not public money. I
Oh,
mean,
isn't it? Okay.
I mean, what's rather dodgy is that he was basically, this should be made, the Royal Lodge should be made commercially available. When the Queen Mother died 20 years ago, he was basically allowed to move in there. He has agreed to refurbish it and paid £7.5 million to do that. and then he pays a peppercorn rent. So he has a lease, to a 75-year lease, and the king can't really throw him out. Where he's vulnerable is that he's clearly got responsibilities to keep up the maintenance of the property, and there's some questions about whether he's doing that. And that again is a mystery because he has plenty of money. I mean, he inherited money when he was born, when the Queen Mother died. He's made quite a lot of money recently from some of his business activities. So he could easily afford to do the place up and indeed to pay for his own security, which is the other area where he's vulnerable. The king is paying for security at the moment. Um, uh, I think the thing is the king sees the bigger picture. It doesn't look good in terms of optics to have a non-working royal in a huge house. Um, and I think there are clearly plans to move the Prince and Princess of Wales there. But Andrew's perfectly within his rights. But goes back to a long-standing rivalry between the brothers. Charles has always been rather jealous of Andrew, the good-looking one who could do what he wanted in life. Charles' career was pretty prescribed. And I think Charles is also concerned about the brand, and so of course should Andrew. And the brand is being damaged by this battle. But what they're doing is they're playing out this fight in public. The fact that people have seen the lease means that Andrew must be leaking to the press. I know that there's a lot of comments coming from the palace that the courtiers and others are trying to use the press to force Andrew out. Um, but naturally, we all want to be able to pass things on to our children. So I'm on his side there. I think it's unfortunate that he doesn't play a more public role, that he hasn't attempted to work his passage back. I mean, he could easily have done that with charitable work in the way that John Profumo did. And he's chosen just to play golf and watch videos and see his mates and travel in the Middle East. He still could have a role in public life, even quietly behind the scenes, and he's chosen not to do that. But
Interesting.
again, what we're seeing is a substitute battle being played out. So, are the girls, the two daughters, going to have royal duties in the slimmed down monarchy, or and is that the way of, in some ways, that's this what the battle is really about, rather than royal lodge? There's clearly pressure on the royal family to fulfill all their duties. Certainly, Beatrice, the older daughter, is keen to do things, but she herself doesn't have the greatest public relations reputation. So is she the right person to do that? And does she want to do it? She's got a young family, she's got a job. So, there are big questions here about the future of the monarchy and what we have. I mean, my own feeling is the monarchy should be slimmed down, that people don't want to be paying for lots of royals who perhaps might be getting up to mischief. But we've got to then taper our expectations, and we can't have them opening every hospital and supporting every charity. Other people have to do that.
Ollie, well, you've given us enough red meat to last us the whole summer, I reckon, there, Andrew.
Oh, I hope so.
Lots
Good.
to think about, and also made me more than ever keen to see your book when it's finished. It's going to be amazing, I think. It's not just about Andrew; it's about Fergie as well, um, and the whole subject of trying to find information about the rich and the powerful, which is a very good way to go to our next guest, isn't it? Because he is somebody who knows more than most about that. He's probably the expert on these legal efforts that people use, that rich and powerful people can use to try and suppress people like Andrew. So, do you want to introduce him?
Yes, well, David Hooper, I've known 40 years. He's a very distinguished lawyer, but he's also an author in his own right. He's worked very closely with publishers over the years, and one of his specialities, apart from libel, is is working with writers to protect them. And he has written a book on these basically the way that the law is now being used by rich and powerful people, often from abroad, particularly Russian oligarchs, to suppress freedom of information in this country. And there have been a number of cases, and it's exactly the experience I had with fighting the appeal by Southampton University against the release of some of these Mountbatten diaries and letters. They play the thing as long as they can. They try and push up your expenses in the hope that they'll break you or force you to back down.
Yeah, well, as
And
writers and producers, we've all signed contracts where basically we agree to take on the risk because publishers and broadcasters increasingly won't do that, which means the people who do have money can just play it long and exhaust you, and it's very scary. And you know this better than most to look at tens of thousands of pounds of costs mounting up, which mean a lot to the writer, but very little to the oligarch.
Exactly, exactly. So in some ways, it's very appropriate that David's talking to us. He rounds up a lot of what we've been talking about over the last 18 months and gives some sort of framework to it. I mean, fortunately, there is a battle now to try and kick these cases out of court quickly. And I think the judges are a bit more aware of how the system is being abused. But maybe we should go over to David and let him tell
Let
us
us
all
do
about it.
that. And thank you for the very powerful intro. See you soon.
Thanks a lot. Bye. Well, we're delighted this week to have David Hooper with us, who has a very distinguished career as a media lawyer, worked a lot with publishers. I think we've known each other probably 35, 40 years, and also as an author in his own right. And he's been very instrumental in criticizing something called SLAPPS, and has in fact just written a book about it, which we will be putting details of on the website. But David, can you tell us what a SLAPP is?
It's an American acronym. Americans are very fond of acronyms, saying strategic lawsuits against public participation. And it's basically where in it it particularly in relation to libel cases in this country, but it can relate to environmental issues as well. But it's where a rich and powerful person is not really interested in their remedy or protecting their reputation, but in silencing criticism. It was very popular with Russian oligarchs.
Well, in your book, you have a whole series of stories about some of the cases you worked on or followed, which relate to the oligarchs. But it's not just oligarchs. I mean, we had a former Conservative cabinet minister bring one of these cases, and it seems to me it's becoming more widespread, isn't it?
It, it is. I mean, the case you referred to was Nadim Zahawi, who was not telling the truth about his tax affairs. He was Chancellor of the Exchequer and he was trying to suppress the fact. I mean, he knew that he couldn't go to court because his lies would be exposed. He was trying to suppress the fact that he had actually paid £5 million in tax, which he was claiming he hadn't had to pay. But in fact, a third of that was a penalty because he had been less than frank with the HMRC, of which you've by that stage become the boss. And he was just trying to silence the other side.
Was he successful in that case?
No, he wasn't, because he met up with a very formidable adversary, Dam Needle, who he Zahawi no doubt thought, because Zahawi is an extremely wealthy man, no doubt thought that he could steamroller, but he really met his match in that. And um, Needle knew exactly what he was talking about. He was a former distinguished tax lawyer at a leading city firm, and he knew exactly what Zahawi had been up to, and he exposed it. And Zahawi had to resign. He was
It's very
completely
effective.
exposed. But
And,
normally these guys get away with it.
I mean, what's the history of slaps? I mean, you in your book you take it back to sort of Robert Maxwell and Jimmy Goldsmith and others. I mean, did they really start this whole thing in the 70s?
Yes, I mean, Goldsmith was really the very first one, um, where he thought that I mean, he issued no less than 90 writs against Private Eye, and he tried to shut Private Eye down because they were looking into his business dealings. He also tried to get them prosecuted for criminal libel. And in fact, he did bring criminal libel proceedings. And I mean, he reckoned that by the power of his money, he could wear them down. And to a certain extent, he did. I mean, Private Eye did in the end reach a an accommodation with him where they paid his costs. But I mean, in fact, Goldsmith was the loser. I mean, there are perils in bringing cases like this, particularly against the likes of Private Eye, that they hit back and they win in the court of public opinion.
Well, you
And
make
they
that
set
point.
up a fund called Golden Balls, which really did more damage to
I
uh,
remember it well.
Goldsmith.
And I mean, you make the point also with McDonald's. There was a case there with two activists, and they sued or tried to bring a slap against them, which they sort of won, but their reputation was tarnished.
It just never occurred to McDonald's that if you threaten proceedings against this small group called London Greenpeace, that you couldn't steamroller them as well. But it was a public relations disaster. The case ran for 10 years. The hearings in court lasted over 360 days. And this was in the 1990s and must have cost McDonald's about £10 million, which of course they couldn't recover from the two unemployed people that they had sued. And it was public relations disaster. And even though they won, quite a lot of their habits, their practices as to how they um, kept looked after their cattle and how they their employment practices was very, very damaging. And the judge certainly made a few findings that were very awkward for them.
What happened to the
I know you.
activists? You say that they weren't able to repay whatever they were supposed to repay, but would they still be notionally on the hook for that money even now?
Well, what if they'd lost the action?
I thought you said McDonald's had won. Sorry.
Well,
Yes,
sorry,
no,
cut
no,
them off.
no, no. McDonald's certainly, McDonald's certainly won the case, but the the award that they got was, of course, unenforceable against people who were living off unemployment benefit. The publicity was absolutely dreadful,
Right.
and that the judge made a number of findings about their practices and ethics, which were again very damaging. And McDonald's have never done it again.
Mm.
But I mean, we did have this case with Aaron Banks and whether he had links to Russia with the Guardian journalist. And in fact, she did get caught because I think the decision was reversed at the appeal court and she was hit with some pretty hefty costs.
Yes, in that case, the judge said that it wasn't, in fact, a slap. But of course, at that stage, we had no slap laws. And the judge, I think, was rather avoiding the issue because you there had a very wealthy person um, suing a journalist, Carol Cadwallader, personally, and not going against the um, stronger, more well-financed um, uh, targets like Der Spiegel and CNN, who had also uh, published these allegations. But
And
I mean,
Ted,
that was a classic case of how difficult it is for defendants to defend cases because she she won um, for most of the case, but then at the end, because the offending material remained on somebody else's website, she ended up by losing in the end.
and why are so many Russian cases coming to London, often when there doesn't seem to be much relevance to the to Britain in the case? And is that likely to stop in future?
Well, I think it will stop because so many of them are now sanctioned and it's more difficult to bring slap actions. But basically, it was a way of stopping bad publicity. There was sometimes ulterior motives because people were subject to sanctions and they thought this way they could get the sanctions lifted. Well, that didn't actually work. And it was a way, it was a form of reputation laundering. And of course, sometimes people did it to please Mr. Putin. That was certainly the case against um, Catherine Belton's book, which had been on sale happily for a year until Navalny of sacred memory had recommended it, whereupon Putin got his cronies to bring these often quite specious libel claims against the book to try and silence them.
And
Because I mean, it was very often.
what was their argument? Did they say that she was making up stories about them being oligarchs and criminals or corruption? And did she have any kind of a defense, whether she could afford it or not?
She had a very, very good defense. I mean, because she had put these allegations. And of course, a lot of these allegations had been previously published without um, um, uh, challenge, and some of the claims were thrown out, but and some of them were very, very marginal, but they tried to settle them when they could because the costs ran into the millions, and publishers just don't have that sort of money to
Well,
spend on
that is really
defending cases.
sinister and scary story, that one.
But I mean, she was lucky. She had HarperCollins supporting her. But I mean, you do talk about how many sort of programs and books are not written or published because of this. It's rather insidious. And I mean, even the program on Abramovich was only shown after he was sanctioned and people felt safe to show it. But I get the feeling also the judges are getting fed up with this, particularly Justice Nicklin, who occurs in a number of your cases. I mean, do you see things changing now?
Yes, I think things will change now. You're absolutely right that the cases that come to court are the tip of the iceberg. And they're not actually that many libel cases, but we should all be interested in this because it's our right to information and freedom of speech in a way that we're not really concerned about litigation between that occurs between people like Abramovich and Berezovsky.
I mean, you do make a series of recommendations at the end of the book for specialist judges for speeding up the process, and really action being taken against some pretty unscrupulous law firms in Britain who are prepared to support these people. I mean, can you just tell us a little bit more of what, you know, your sort of perfect series of changes?
Yes, I mean, the judges have got the measure of these people, and you mentioned Mr. Justice Nicklin. I mean, he said, and also as he then was, Mr. Justice Simon got the measure of the cases brought against Bill Browder. The great problem with it was that you'd had about a year of litigation before the cases got to court. Now, I think we don't quite know how this is all going to pan out, but there is a second SLAPP Act going through Parliament, and a lot is going to depend on the rules of procedure that are going to be changed. Because what you need to do is to get cases quickly before judges, specialist judges, who can weigh up the balance of protecting people's
But there's a rather
reputation, which,
appropriate mug has appeared. Private eye mug.
oh, right.
Sorry.
But you need to balance the protection of people's reputation against the public interest in knowing. And not every case has to be brought. I mean, after all, people live with quite a lot of bad material about them on social media. It's just we need to work out ways to get cases, because what people want is cheap and swift justice. And I think we have to allow the judges a degree of discretion, because clearly something serious is said against the people and there doesn't appear to be any merit in the allegations and that they probably can't be defended. Then clearly people should be entitled to vindicate their reputation. But you need judges to be able to look at it, and you also need people to place their cards fairly and squarely on the table. So rather than, as these claimant lawyers do, keeping their cards very close to their chest and saying, well, to the defendants, you've got the burden of proving the truth of this. You go ahead and do it and see how much it'll cost you.
And I mean, you talk about the Solicitors Regulation Organization, Association, I think it is, and the Bar Council. I mean, could they be doing more to self-policing this, or are greedy lawyers just very happy just to make some money and to hell with the client?
Well, the Bar Council are absolutely useless. I mean, they just say, well, of course, it's for other people to change the law. we apply the cab rank principle, but it doesn't actually work that way. We aren't talking about cabs, we're talking about great big black limousines with darkened windows. And a certain number of barristers do bring these cases and do make the cases possible. They make them costly and expensive. So we're not getting much help really from barristers on this. But on the other hand, the Solicitors Regulation Authority have really rather made the running on this. They have indicated what is acceptable practice and what is not acceptable practice. And they have looked into a number of firms. They've investigated about 60 cases, and I think they've certainly found so far that one of the cases does involve possible slap-like behaviour, but we haven't yet found all their findings. But I think it's less probably what happened in the past, because it was perhaps a little uncertain as to where the legitimate parameters lay for what solicitors could legitimately and not legitimately do. But I think solicitors are going to have to change their practice. You can't just write these interminable letters that certain well-known claimant law firms do, and you can't run up costs, you can't bring a multiplicity of actions. And I think one of the other things that the SRA are looking into very closely at the moment are the use of private investigators who are often used to intimidate. And
you had experienced that yourself, didn't you? I mean, an attempt to find out more about you when you were involved in one of the cases.
yes, I found I mean, it was a perfectly straightforward libel action where there was an argument as to the enforceability of a settlement agreement. It was a pure matter of law to decide. But 2 years after the case had, we thought, been resolved, I found that I had been massively hacked, our barrister had been hacked, members of his chambers. When I say hack, they had tried to hack them. Sometimes they were successful and sometimes they weren't successful. They had hacked our clients, they had hacked my family, they had hacked our clients' internal lawyers, external lawyers. And there's no evidence that the law firm was involved in this, but this sort of behavior has no place in litigation. It was clearly related to the litigation, and we need to work out ways to ensure that this sort of thing cannot happen. It's totally unacceptable because it gives access to confidential information. It can intimidate things, it gives scope to intimidate witnesses. It's totally totally unacceptable. And one of the things I discovered, and in fact, one of the hackers is now serving a 80-month jail sentence in a New York jail. And he had boasted of breaking my password. Yeah, and it's just totally unacceptable. And we've got to put an end to it, because it was clear from research done at the University of Toronto by an organization called Citizen Lab that it's an increasing amount. It happens more and more in litigation. Of course, one can't always prove, or one can very seldom prove, whether or not lawyers know about it. But in some cases, lawyers must know about it.
What would
And
be the purpose otherwise? I mean, I remember, hearing you talk the other day with Charlotte Leslie, who's, for our listeners, was a Conservative MP who was the victim of one of these slaps because she wanted to make due diligence inquiries about a Middle Eastern council that she ran. And I mean, they were spying on her, her partner, and even the dog, weren't they?
it was absolutely outrageous, and it was intimidating conduct. They were digging up every sort of bit of malicious gossip. And it's a total disgrace. And of course, there's no real control over these private investigators. And what they it wasn't just private investigators. There were also these public relations advisors who would, when there were court hearings coming up, uh, think of putting um, adverse stories about Charlotte Leslie in the press, and it's all there documented, and documented them discussing that with the solicitors, and the solicitors should not charge this with a barge pole. If it was indeed the case, which in fact it wasn't, that Charlotte Leslie had libeled the claimant, that claim should have been allowed to go ahead. But you don't need all these parasitic private investigators and PR people to try and dig out material to blacken somebody. Just bring your case by applying ordinary principles, and win it if you've got a good case,
I mean,
lose it
what
if you've got a bad one.
struck me was, I mean, I think you say how libel lawyers are paid a great deal more than normal lawyers. Now, why is that? And that's why we have such, large costs in these
They have
cases.
richer clients, Andrew.
Well, not always, I suppose.
Well, not always, because of course, quite often they are hoping that the defendant will pay the costs. And the courts really have been rather taken in my view, by the amounts claimed. But because since the law firms claim that they must be paid at least £500 an hour, often more than that, it's assumed that it's all uh, very complicated, and it is only complicated because people have chosen to make it complicated. I mean, the defamation case is not complicated in the way that many transactions are, or many areas of law like social security law or immigration law uh, can be very, very complicated. But it's people have just been allowed to get away with it. And um, what you also find is that libel actions are incredibly expensive, deterringly expensive, compared to their equivalents in France or Italy, where things that cost hundreds of thousands here will probably only cost 20 or 30,000 euros in France.
So
They
could
are,
we
Andrew.
learn?
Andrew, before your next book comes out, you need to relocate.
I need to get insurance. Well, my own case with defamation was that my own solicitor said I should just settle and pay 25,000 to this person. It had no validity at all. I said no. It was struck out, but it took 2 years, cost 100 grand. And in the end, the other person paid 75. I still had to pay 25, but at least I had the satisfaction of feeling I'd seen it off. But could we learn more from the continent? I mean,
Sounds like it.
is that likely to sort of happen, that we, in terms of reforming things, that we look at models elsewhere?
Well, I think that's very important, and it's something that I'm planning to do over the course of next year, to see how well the systems work. Because I mean, what people basically want is a decision. I mean, because I'm not sure that spending hundreds of thousands of pounds necessarily gets you better justice. I think there's
No.
rather a strong argument that it gets you rather worse justice, because one side has these hundreds of thousands of pounds and the other side doesn't. And I think we've just got to trust judges. They may not always get it right. There may be arguments that if the case had gone on longer, you might have um, dug up the material. But then the argument is, well, it might have perhaps been prudent to have that material, to have the supporting material before you publish.
Well,
So
no,
I
I
think
won the
it.
case. I won the case, but I just, you don't always get all your costs. So, but we did wait for a year for a decision, which seems to me a long time. You can't imagine a judge can really remember the case from a year before.
Well, that's why the advice was no doubt given to you by your solicitors, because people might think that because you won it in the end, your solicitor's advice was wrong. I think your solicitor was trying to save you from this financial pain, and of course, it's a libel action is a very difficult and unpleasant thing because it can open up whole areas of inquiry, and um, it takes an enormous amount of your resources and your time. And it's also a very great strain. As you say, you are out of pocket. And particularly if we can just go back for a moment to the Russian cases, I mean, Bill Browder won his case against this Russian policeman, aided and abetted by a well-known firm of lawyers who really shouldn't have touched this man with a barge pole. But he was left with a bill of £662,000 as this man vamoosed back, refused any orders from the court to come and explain his means or put forward proposals. And of course, he's now disappeared back to Russia, from whence he'd been sent to bring his unmeritorious case. And Elliot Higgins, a very worthy person behind Bellingcat, the open source researchers who have revealed many things. He was sued by, of all people, Evgeny Prigozhin, of the Wagner Group, who was subsequently shot down by the Russians. But he was left with a £70,000 bill, and Prigozhin, who had plenty at the time, had plenty of money, just disappeared back to Russia.
But why isn't money put into court in these circumstances, and just to cover that eventuality?
Well,
because in one case, I think with Carol, she had to put in £400,000 at one point.
Well, I think people are so nervous that they might be depriving um, people of access to justice. I think the real answer is to make these cases very much cheaper, and also where people win get orders in their favor against a claimant, they should have to pay them there and then. It's quite difficult getting security for costs, but it's a certain. I think you're right. I think it should certainly be looked into, and it should be used more often if people want to go on with cases. And it may well be that the courts will look at it slightly different. I mean, certainly bringing um, uh, complaints that something is a SLAPP action, there are going to be provisions where a defendant will have more protection against having an order for costs. If you say to the court, this is a SLAPP action, and you've got a good argument that it might be a SLAPP action, you're not going to be clobbered with massive costs if you lose that application. But the case, of course, may still go to court.
Do you have
I
any
mean,
much
your book,
confidence that a new government, a new justice secretary might change things, speed things up, make things cheaper, or would it not be a priority for them, do you think?
Well, I think the problem with the new government is going to be that there are so many things they are going to want to change after 14 years of a Conservative government, that this may be um, fairly low on their priorities. And there have now been, in the last year, 2 attempts to bring in a SLAPPS law. One was when a SLAPPS law was just uh, tacked on to an economic crimes bill, which wasn't a very satisfactory way of doing it. And there is bipartisan support for a private member's bill brought by Wayne Daniels, which, if it is suitably amended, and everyone seems to be working in that way, is probably going to be it for the time being with SLAPPS. And I think that what they're trying to do is to make sure that the rules of court are streamlined so that the anti-SLAPP provisions work. But I think what is needed, and it may be a bit down the incoming government's priority, is a whole look at libel law, because it's still far too slanted in favor of claimants. And of course, it's even without SLAPPS, it is a rich man's thing. There seems to be an assumption that people who are not extremely wealthy don't have a reputation. And it's very difficult. I mean, there are lawyers who will take on claims, but they've got to be real slam dunk claims before people do take them on. And claimant solicitors firms don't tend to take cases on where there is more than a 30% chance of failure. So you've got to have a very strong case before they will take it on. And it would make life a lot easier if you could just have a capped cost and a very strict timetable which people couldn't depart from, and avoid all these. I mean, where these cases get so complicated is that there are always these applications as what has to be disclosed, whether the pleading is technically correct. And just make it, I think, a fairly rough and ready procedure, and which is what you get is in if you have a motor accident or something of that sort. I mean, I think you don't have to treat libel claims as being so rarefied and so forth. I mean, people don't seem to get libels for some strange reason in France and Germany because I mean, life seems to go on, or if they have claims, they are quickly resolved. You know, people don't make such a fuss about them.
And what's been the reaction to your book? I mean, it's only just out, but have people come forward with other stories of SLAPP actions, or have people been, and you wrote it very carefully, I can tell, but have people come back to you and said that perhaps this hasn't been an accurate portrayal?
Well, when the book was serialized in the Times, I had two letters of complaint, one from Mohammed Amersi and the other from some official in the Conservative Party. But I sent them one letter and I never heard from them again. So fortunately, nobody has complained, but one does still hear of these cases taking on. But I think things are changing. Certainly, the practice of lawyers is beginning to change, but there are still certainly cases going on, and although Russians are sanctioned and probably can't bring cases, you've still got the Azerbaijanis, you've got Swedes living in Malta, you've got people in, Swedes living in Monaco, you've got Maltese, you've got Americans bringing these claims. So the problem still exists.
Gosh, well, I mean, I think your book will contribute to, I hope, a sea change. I mean, it's shocking when you see it all put together like that, and just the way that people can be sort of browbeaten and broken using these techniques. But that's been brilliant. You know, thank you so much for talking to us. You know, it's
Was that all right? Good.
very good. No, and we'll send
I
you.
was
Okay,
gonna say,
well,
it's not a very
when it goes up.
positive, time to be an investigative journalist or a writer, is it these days? I mean, there's fewer newspapers or broadcasters will pay for it, and if you do it and you challenge some powerful, especially a powerful foreign oligarch, you're going to be high and dry in the courts. I really think that that's just not.
Well, one of the things that has changed, I mean, when I started in the law, if you had some claims against the Daily Mail, I mean, they used rather similar tactics, that they would just reject everything, so hoping that people would drop out and run out of money. Now the shoe is on the other foot, as it were.
Yes.
And of course, the media don't have the money to defend these claims, and claimants do.
That's
And I think what's shocking is they go, as you say, for the weakest point, not for the big organizations that might be able to respond. And that's often to people where these allegations have been made previously, and nothing has been done. So it seems to me it's not a consistent the law isn't being applied very consistently.
Yeah. Well, let's hope
No,
that they can copy the better practice that you say happens in Italy and France, because
yeah,
just making it quicker and
yeah.
cheaper would make people feel so much more confident about doing the kind of work that we all want to see done.
Well, I think that's going to be my task this year um, to talk to various media lawyers around Europe, and just say, well, really, we really ought to look at this system. And I think an incoming government, might be quite sympathetic to that, saying, well, let's have a look at because I mean the thing that people can sue on, um, which happened with say Abramovich, um, the can sue on things that have been doing the rounds for ages, and also the fact that lawyers just don't have to take any inquiry at all as to whether the facts are true. I mean, obviously, you have to rely on what your client tells you, but some of these cases, I mean, like Prigogine, I mean, it was clear that he was a notorious criminal, and yet we
Mass
were able
murderer,
to,
torturer.
yeah.
You know, well,
And I mean, it's just shocking sort of videos of people having their heads cut off or being bludgeoned to death because they deserted from
I
the
know, and all these lovely
Wagner Group.
London lawyers saying, "Yes, we'll have £1,000 a day for
Yeah.
your, you know,
Well, I mean, that was the thing in
an
the
hour.
Leslie
Sorry, an
case.
hour."
There was an unlimited budget, and lawyers rubbed their hands together.
Sue,
Yeah.
grab
Well,
it and run,
we
as
must have you back
Bogdahl used to
after
say.
you've done your further research and give us an update.
Yeah, thank
Okay,
you
well,
so
I'm
much.
sorry there were sort of few gaps, but they presumably can be edited out.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah,
we very rarely
And
bother with that,
yeah,
but
and we'll put people onto your book because we've clearly not
yes,
covered lots and lots of stories there,
yeah,
but I do recommend it. It's
yeah.
fascinating the wealth of material you've got.
and good luck with your cause. Let's hope
Oh,
the
well,
new
thank
government
you
will
very
do
much.
something.
And Andrew, I'm enjoying a book written by one of your authors coming out in August, which is absolutely riveting.
Trying to remember which one that is.
Tim Tate.
Oh, Tim Tate, of course,
Yeah,
yes, of course,
Oh,
yes,
he's been
yes,
on the
yeah. I
yes.
mean,
podcast.
it is fantastic.
Yes,
Yeah,
well, that's another case in which you were involved. That's a
yeah,
spy catcher case, and we're hoping
yeah.
Tim will come and speak. So, of
But
course, I forgot that link.
yeah, but I mean, if you want something, well, I mean, you probably want Tim on, but I mean, if you want a sort of commendation of it, be very happy to do
Yes,
it.
thank you. Well,
And
maybe that
and
might
I
be a case you
and
haven't voted
I'm
for.
thinking also of doing I'm going to dig out my Chapman Pincher stuff. But I mean, it's very, very good, and it's a very, very compelling story because I mean, there must now be an enormous amount in the archives because
Yes,
he's really, really,
yes,
really, really turned it over.
yeah. No, no. It's. We hope it'll make a film. So, it's a great story.
That'll be good.
It'll make an extremely good film, and I sort of originally thought, well, isn't that rather all old hat? But it isn't. It's very, very topical,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and
Well, I mean, this report
also
today.
the inclination of governments to lie.
Exactly. Well, there's a report out today on the Cabinet Office and they're lying, so
Yeah,
it doesn't go away.
yeah. No, no. I think it's a real winner on that. I mean, the only thing is, it's quite complicated to the new. I think it's one of those things that you probably slightly have to spoon feed it to a number. I mean, obviously, a number of journalists are going to know about it, um, but I think you actually got to just tell people what's in there because I mean it's absolute dynamite.
Yeah. No, no, it's a great
And
story.
and you also want to get Richard Norton Taylor to write about it. He would absolutely love it. I mean,
Well,
I
we
don't.
will. I'm
I mean,
sure we will. Maybe, yes, he was
He's
one of
another of
the
our friends now. He's been on the
we
podcast too.
we interviewed him a few weeks ago. But yes, absolutely. No, there's a
no,
contingent
no, no.
of people.
He'll be terrific on that.
Great.
David,
Well,
thank you
thank
so
you so
much.
much for sparing
Not at
time.
all. Not
And
at all.
really
Great
enjoyed the
pleasure.
book.
Okay.
Okay,
Good luck
Bye.
with
we'll
it.
alert you. Thanks a
And your
lot. Bye.
Bye.
campaign.
Bye.
Bye. Well, I should actually explain to people who might have been a bit confused. We did talk to David a week or two before the election was called, which is why we talk about there might be an election soon. And now, of course, there is one.
Yes, yes. I mean, we've had so many good people sort of lined up that there's been a bit of a backlog. But anyway, I think a really strong one to end on, and I think people will be surprised really about how this thing operates and what's going on. And I
No,
think
I
it
agree.
neatly sums up things. But it'll be interesting to see people's reactions to this.
Well,
And
we
how,
had some really good
you know,
ones. I love to read these out. A few nice ones from last week where we spoke to Stephen Davis. People really enjoyed him. Another interesting guest, Peony Rose. Great show, guys. I feel smarter for having listened. Our work here is done. That's Julia Alexandra, 180. I love your shows and discussions, always so interesting. Joni B9, thank you for that. This program gets better and better, but it sadly proves to me that many hardened criminals are not behind bars, and they should be. That's Giovanna Moruzzi. So there you go.
gosh, yes. Well, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think, people realize that they can get away with things, and fortunately we do have a press that sometimes can do things, and this is what we're trying to do in the podcast to raise some of these issues, often historical as well as contemporary.
That's correct. And we should thank several people very, very generous with our thank you button last week, which we do appreciate. And if you do like the shows, as we've said before, please like them, please comment on them. And if you're feeling generous and want to throw us a couple of quid or a couple of dollars, there is a thank you option next to the three little dots.
Yes, thank you, because we're still subsidizing the program ourselves. We're not making money on it, even after 18 months. So all these things help us.
I think actually this month we broke even.
We broke even.
I think
Great.
we
Oh
did.
well, 18 months.
It's a good time to take a short holiday.
Right, exactly. I can relax now.
Yeah, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to have a couple of weeks off. And then in July and August, I am going to do a couple of shows a month by myself. And the first one I can exclusively reveal will be about the very scandalous Peggy Guggenheim. Art,
Oh, nice.
love, sex, of course, politics, the 1920s and 30s, all the stuff that we know people love and I love.
Great. And who you got to speak on that?
Mary Dearborn,
Right.
who's a biographer,
Excellent.
American biographer.
Excellent.
So I'm looking forward
Excellent.
to doing that with her. And then getting back in harness with you in the autumn.
Yep. Looking forward to that. Well, you might be so good that people won't want me back.
We'll run a poll.
Oh, no, maybe not.
All right. Well, thanks to everybody for supporting us for so long. We'll have a short break, but we'll see you very soon.
See you soon. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Scandal Mongers podcast. This has been a Podcast World production. You can get in contact with our show by emailing team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandal Mongers in the heading, or via our social media links within the show's bio.